Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to CGHE seminar/webinar number 288. I'm Simon Marginson, sharing the webinar today from my Oxford office and not from home as usual, so less books and more pictures in the background. Today we've got Alison Wheaton with us. Alison has completed a doctorate which is focused on governance of higher education, a topic which is of great interest to many around the world. She's been looking at English university governing bodies. I'll introduce Alison in a moment. Let me take you through the webinar protocols first. Now, remember that the webinar is being recorded and it soon ends up on in our YouTube channel via the CG website, usually within a day or so. A transcript of the chat function from today will also be posted on our website. During the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or you've got to the stage of asking a question. And there's no need to have your video on during the webinar either. We recommend using speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, develop your question in the chat. You may want to make a statement rather than ask a question, but we'd like to hear it on camera. Again, put it forward in the chat. On the basis of what's coming forward in the chat, I'll select people into the Q&A, and usually if you bring your ideas forward early, you get into the discussion. If you come in the last 5 minutes, you can miss out. When you're invited in, and if I can, I'll send you a message through the chat, a private message through the chat to say, I'm going to ask you to speak. When you're invited in, please unmute yourself, and most important, switch on your video and state your name and where you are from. So then you become a full, active, visible, audible participant in the webinar and you can speak freely. Alison Wheaton has done her doctoral study of English university governing bodies at the Institute of Education at UCL in the UK. She presented these findings at an earlier stage, an earlier part of her findings, in an April 2021 CG webinar, that is a year ago. She authored a report for the Higher Education Policy Institute regarding university governor remuneration in 2019. Previously, she served as a governor, as a president of a UK private higher education provider. And during that time, she served on HEFCI's Leadership, Governance and Management Strategic Advisory Council. So she is both poacher and gamekeeper. She knows this area well, and we look forward to hearing from her. The screen is now yours, Alison.
Thank you, Simon.
We can see that. Thanks, Alison.
Great. Thank you, Simon, for your introduction. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here today. As you mentioned, I presented the findings regarding English university governing body composition last April. Today, I'll share my findings regarding how governors perceive their roles and why. I will briefly provide background regarding the literature used and the study's methodology and analytical framework, but I plan to spend the bulk of our time discussing the key findings, including cross-cutting themes. Here, some audience participation is required because I've included a significant number of governor quotes, which I'll ask you to read. One of the aims of this study was to bring their voices to these deliberations. Before I dive in, I'd like to reflect for a moment on this topic's relevance. As in many other countries, English university governing bodies are at least nominally accountable for all aspects of university governance. The risk of clashes between corporate and academic approaches to governance has increased as the governing body roles in institutional governance become more significant. Research indicates that relative to European counterparts, English universities have more institutional autonomy and have historically been seen as relatively good practice in engaging with the academic community. However, trends such as corporatization, laicization, and boardism have also been identified. I think boardism is particularly interesting as it's identified as part of a wider shift towards universities as stakeholder organizations. Further, research indicates that in order to assess effectiveness, one needs to first clearly identify governing body roles. Whilst the research was conducted in English universities, I broadened the literature review to include that pertaining to corporate, public sector, and non-for-profits in the UK, US, and Australia. I added Europe to the higher education literature. I excluded what have been described as university governance models, such as collegial or bureaucratic, as they tend to overlook the governing bodies. I don't have time to discuss the literature in greater detail today, but we'll refer to the relevant work as appropriate and have provided extensive references in the PowerPoint slides. My original research questions were these. Today's session focuses on the second, but I will refer to findings regarding the first as appropriate. I conducted the research at both system and institution level. At system level, I gathered data about governing body composition and roles from sector-wide documentary evidence from 1985 to 2020. Included here is the Committee of University Chairs 2020 Governance Code, which provides a template statement of governing body primary responsibilities, which all English universities use as a guide, but many tailor to their own needs. Here today, the findings regarding governing body roles, both at sector level from documentary evidence and expert informants, are treated as background information and will be compared and contrasted to my institutional level findings. I conducted 5 university case studies. I used data from documentary evidence primarily to inform a 60-minute semi-structured interview conducted with a cross-section of governing body members. As noted here, the scope of the interviews included motivation to join, governing body purpose and stakeholders, along with roles and influences. For analytical purposes, I adopted Zara and Pierce's strategy, control, and service role clusters and added individual considerations to Hung's external and internal influences of governing body roles. Both of these were developed in light of previous research into corporate sector board roles. I also adopted Zara and Pierce's governing body attributes as part of my analytical framework. I added some of my own based on higher education governing body literature, such as motivations to join, meeting agendas, and what happens in a crisis. The key dimensions were composition and characteristics, scope, and practices, as shown in this table. Items in bold here were considered at both sector and case study level. Those ticked, such as motivation to join and role specifications, were covered at case study level alone. Others were in effect treated as out of scope, although sometimes they did come up in conversation. I used a range of governance theories as explanatory tools. I did not attempt to prove or disprove any of them, simply to see if the underlying concepts would assist in data analysis. I list here the primary original scholars as well as a number of HE scholars who have either directly or indirectly written about the theories. Rather than relying on the higher education scholars' interpretations of the original work, I went back to the source material. Also, Professor Cornforth's work in non-for-profits was helpful. He originally set out this sort of framework of thinking about the theories and the roles. I added institutional theory to his original list, as it is often used in higher education studies outside of, interestingly, institutional governance, and I thought the influence of norms from outside of higher education might be relevant. Apart from Simon's work in Australian universities, there's been remarkably little material in higher education regarding managerial hegemony, which is surprising since until recently it could be seen as a highly relevant theory. While some scholars dismiss agency theory in universities as there are no owners, others argue that the agency problem is worse in non-for-profits because the managers don't bear the wealth effect of their decisions. Stewardship theory includes positive expectations regarding internal member contributions to board level governance. Resource dependence theory received a great deal of attention early on from HE scholars, but that focus has waned. I sought a purposive sample of 5 English universities as my case studies. They represent the predominant mid to large scale universities in terms of student numbers and total income. I excluded smaller and specialist institutions as early research identified different considerations and dynamics regarding governing body roles. My cases included 2 post-92 universities, a new university, and an original polytechnic, and 3 pre-92 universities. And those included a former College of Advanced Technology, one established in the 1960s by central government, and a much longer established Russell Group University. The universities experienced a range of performance on student numbers since the removal of the cap. That was not one of my selection criteria, but I've shown it on this table. So you can see the range, which actually goes from left to right in terms of decrease in student numbers to increases. I also sought out interesting governing body attributes and found one post-92 with a rather larger governing body, one with more frequent meetings, and a pre-92 with a smaller governing body and more meetings. The cases represented a good geographic mix and location type in terms of big city, regional hubs, and smaller towns. 61 governors, including all 5 chairs, vice chancellors, and secretaries, participated in the interviews, as did most of the key committee chairs, other lay members, as well as staff and student members. In total, the interviewees represented 60% of the possible population. Lay participants came from a good variety of sectors, as noted here on the slide. I'm now going to move to my findings. There was greater consensus amongst governors regarding the influences on their roles than the roles themselves. This table reflects influences identified by governors at 3 or more of the universities. The majority of governors across 4 or 5 universities identified 6 key influences, 3 internal, shown here in bold, 2 external, and 1 individual. Those with an asterisk were identified by fewer governors, but still across all 3 universities. Governors identified the Vice Chancellor's approach, culture, and governing body attributes as the main internal influences. The regulator, the Office for Students, and the introduction of tuition fees were seen as the primary external influences. Their own experience of governance in both executive and non-executive capacities were identified, particularly by lay members and vice chancellors, as the key individual influence. I should comment that the pandemic's receipt of fewer mentions reflects the timing of the research. 2 of my cases were completed before March 2020, the other 3 before the end of July 2020. There are some notable absences on this list of influences, and that includes things like governing documents, induction, and training that some people might expect governors to refer to when asked about their roles. The majority of governors at 4 or more of the case universities identified 10 key roles, which align to these role clusters. However, I renamed 2 of the role clusters in it for the English university setting. I renamed control to oversight and service to support. I'll discuss this more fully in a moment. I also identified a 4th emerging role cluster, that of influencing the organizational culture and values, which I've shown across the top. As it spans strategy, oversight, and support, I thought it warrants its own cluster. I'm going to talk more about these roles in a moment when I refer to the cross-cutting themes. Here I provide a number of quotes. I'm not going to come back to culture and values, so here I provide a number of quotes regarding culture and values. While the first 3 are somewhat predictable, the other 3 I think are more nuanced, and I'm going to leave you a few moments to look at these. The case study findings indicated several gaps compared to sector expectations of roles. These include the setting of institutional mission, which is almost always taken as given, which may come as a relief for some. Oversight, let alone the sign off of any sort of institutional plans, except for 2 cases. Oversight of risk management, governors emphasized risk identification. There was little mention of safeguarding of institutions' reputation and facilitating legitimization of governance, apart from a few mentions. There were, however, some notable additions, which included the new culture and values role cluster I've already discussed, understanding students' experiences, and also supporting the executive. And by the way, that's the executive, not just the vice chancellor. Compared to more recent corporate and higher education studies, strategy roles are relatively consistent throughout, although governors at only 1 university identified an explicit gatekeeper role. And that's different to a decision-making role, but I'll come back to the strategy roles in the cross-cutting themes. In a corporate setting, agreeing the organization's mission is seen as a key governing body role. As I mentioned, in universities, it's more taken as given. Governors in this study placed a much greater emphasis on oversight roles compared to previous higher education studies, and much more specific focus on students' experiences. This may relate to the new regulatory regime. Also, findings differ in a crisis. Corporate governing bodies are seen to take more control. In this research, they were more supportive of the executive, but did not seek control per se. There was also less focus on performance monitoring, which in corporate research has been linked to the externalization of performance metrics. Support roles differed significantly from corporate studies, and I'll discuss this as the final cross-cutting theme. Finally, potential conflicts for staff governors and ambiguities regarding the status of governing bodies remain, as identified by the largest historic study of UK university governing bodies some 25 years ago. 5 cross-cutting themes emerge from the study. The first 3 relate to influences, the other 2, the roles themselves. I will take each of these now in turn. The first is the importance of governing body attributes. When I started this research, I did not know if the range of attributes identified in corporate settings would be relevant in a university. I found they are, but for different reasons, I suspect, and that's a topic for another day. Originally, I collected the data regarding governing body composition in terms of size, member types, and lay member characteristics out of curiosity. It wasn't until the governor interviews, however, that their significance became clear. Governors in each of the case studies described a shift of lay members away from the great and the good towards those recruited for their skills and experience. And it's not all corporate. Lay members include significant numbers from other sectors, with the numbers of lay academic members increasing from a small base. This interrelates in part to different ways of recruiting members, some of whom come with different motives and expectations. The vast majority of lay members do not consider that they in any way represent external stakeholders, with the exception of at the Russell Group University. However, these lay members describe norms and expectations. All lay members describe norms and expectations from their executive and non-executive experience in other sectors, a source of normative isomorphic pressure. As noted in my previous webinar, governing bodies across the English university landscape have become more similar in size and member types, but are still large at over 19 members with almost universal staff and student membership, most of whom do see themselves as representing internal stakeholders. Stewardship theory espouses internal membership on boards as it brings institution-specific knowledge to oversight functions. However, internal members are largely excluded from committee work, where most of the oversight is conducted. But again, I won't come back to that today, but I think it's a relevant finding. I included here a number of quotes regarding governing body attributes. And again, I'll leave you a few seconds, and in this case, you might have to speed read them. I thought the comments from the Vice Chancellor about representation of industry specialists is interesting, which is sort of the midway through. And also mentioned about parallels with the NHS. And the final comment, there was a deputy chair and a former staff governor who thought the role was the worst job ever. The second theme is the emergence of new stakeholders. I use the term new as there's no empirical evidence regarding how governors perceive governing body stakeholders. Governors explicitly describe students as the most important internal stakeholder, including how the introduction of tuition fees and competition for students has influenced how they perceive their roles. They implicitly described how their experience in other sectors where services or products are consumed influenced how they thought of their roles. And the student stakeholding has greater salience, influence, legitimacy, and urgency, in keeping with previous higher education literature. An interesting issue arising is, where does this leave staff, including the executive as stakeholders? There's a definite primacy of the student stakeholding. Governors at all but the former College of Advanced Technology, which has a more employment focus, identified the regulator as the primary external stakeholder. We'll touch on this a bit more in the next influence, namely contextual considerations. Many governors, particularly those at three institutions which had faced any sort of financial or performance difficulties in recent years, were explicit in their comments regarding the removal of any kind of safety net and increasing uncertainty. This uncertainty was shared by the governing body and the executive. The final one to flag, stakeholder flag, is the rise of debt funders as stakeholders. I would suggest this is less openly explored as capital funding and debt arrangements may be referred to in annual accounts. And I have found the references, but they are in the very back of the accounts. But the conditions which may be attached to such funding is not disclosed. The study suggests debt providers are encroaching on institutional autonomy. Here, the concept of swapping control to reduce uncertainty from resource dependence theory is pertinent. Again, here are some governor quotes regarding governing body stakeholders. I thought the second was interesting, and it describes the potential peril of the student stakeholding and the institutional consequences of it in the third. The last quote is one of several examples where debt providers are impinging on institutional autonomy. I'm sorry, these are quick, but you will have a copy of the slides so people can refer back to them as they need to. Unsurprisingly, context is also an important influence on governing body roles. Governance is set in the wider environment. I've already mentioned greater uncertainty in the policy, funding, and competitive arenas. As noted earlier, increasingly lay governors recruited for their skills and experience are bringing with them norms and expectations from other sectors. The institutional context is also important. At 4 of the 5 case studies, internal and external governors alike describe a palpable shift in the Vice Chancellor's approach, shifting from what outside of higher education is described as managerial hegemony to greater openness and transparency. The motives for this vary and include seeking governor input along with what some governors have described as seeking air cover in an uncertain regulatory environment. Organizational culture has also been identified as a key contextual influence. Whilst the historic divides between academic and other sector organizational cultures are still evident, ongoing industrial actions with regard to terms and conditions of employment, along with the pandemic, is increasing both governors' interest in organizational culture and values, but also vice chancellors' desire for governor input. Finally, the most notable institution-specific contextual consideration is performance. In the case which experienced the most significant unexpected change in performance on the retirement of long-serving vice chancellors, governors undertook a significant reassessment of their roles, with long-serving governors wondering how they did not anticipate the changing fortunes, and incoming governors wishing not to repeat the same mistakes. Again, here are some quotes regarding context. Interestingly, a key sub-theme here is change. Environmental changes, changes in vice chancellor approach, delivering change, and the aforementioned changes in fortune. Moving on to the roles, the first 2 cross-cutting themes pertaining to roles is the importance of governance versus management. Here, the decision control versus decision management paradigm identified by agency theorists is most helpful, according to which the governing body is responsible for decision control, that means approving and monitoring decisions, whilst the executive is responsible for decision management, both initiating and implementing them. Findings here are consistent with other HE scholars, what have identified as a range of potential principles, including the government, students, staff, local communities, with the executives acting as agents. As noted earlier, inconsistent with corporate research, institutional mission tends to be taken as given, and this may relate to universities' charitable status. However, findings identified a spectrum of contribution to institutional strategy consistent with research in UK corporates. There, scholars identified a range from taking decisions, to shaping the context, content, and conduct of strategy. The case studies could easily be placed along this spectrum based on how governors describe their roles relating to strategy. Also, as noted earlier, most oversight and monitoring roles tend to be done by committees, where there are few internal members. With regard to oversight, a range of approaches was identified, ranging from taking assurances to giving assurances to facilitating performance enhancement. Finally, whilst not the focus of the studies, governors made unprompted mention of the two roles with which they were least comfortable, namely academic governance and performance monitoring. They expressed concern regarding blurred and normative ownership of academic governance in particular, and a lack of expertise, time, and place for both. It's worth noting that one case study university had a dedicated performance committee, which included academic performance, and another has an academic governance committee. Governors of those institutions described less discomfort with these roles. Again, I have a pile of quotes here. First, with regard to governance and management. And I thought the third one in particular was interesting because it's the Vice Chancellor saying how he effectively used the discipline of the board to help retain or to help build his executives' focus on performance and implementation. And I also thought the penultimate quote was interesting, distinguish between management of day-to-day, but still understanding the staff experience. I've also included some quotes with regard to strategy, and these range. A number of those highlight the difficulties of translating institutional strategy into a plan and then into measurable progress. And finally, here are some quotes regarding oversight. The first quote is from a chair of a dedicated performance committee. Another chair noted, however, this is in contrast with another chair of an actual board who noted they didn't really follow through regarding performance, his board. The second quote was one of many internal members, excluding the vice chancellors, who expressed disappointment at the level of lay governor challenge and scrutiny. This included their ability to scrutinize academic performance, as noted in a few of the quotes. The final theme related to differing views compared to sector expectations and among governors regarding their institutional service and support roles. Early corporate governance scholars identified providing advice and guidance to executives as one of the relatively few governing body roles. However, by the late 1980s, reflecting the development of resource dependence theory, Zara and Pierce's third role cluster, service, included representing organizations externally, linking to the environment, and securing resources. In this study, sector documentation and expert informants described roles other than securing resources more in keeping with this type of role. However, governors at the case study universities describe much more instrumental and internally focused support roles, consistent with stewardship theory. Further, there were explicit examples where some governing bodies worked with their executive teams to support the executives' improvements to how they initiated and implemented decisions. In doing so, they did not cross the governance versus management line. I think this finding is of great significance. Governors don't have to do things, but rather can assist executives in how they do things. My research suggests how much a governing body is willing and able to help enable the executive to achieve the delivery of objectives depends on the vice chancellor and executive's appetite for the support, and also the governing body members' capacity, capability, and capacity, including that of the chair. The literature in this research indicates trust is key. The development of trust can be facilitated by personal power based on expertise and mutual respect, as opposed to positional power. However, the support roles and the role of the executive in institutional governance is largely undocumented. This research indicates the informality of these support roles is undermining the legitimacy of the governing bodies themselves. Here, numerous governors mention specific institutional practices such as informal meetings between lay members and executives, along with well-documented sector scandals where conflicts of interests were often identified. And last bit of speed reading for you. Here are a few quotes with regard to the support roles. It's worth noting that governors at several universities mentioned the practice of removing governors who did not constructively contribute. One even established a 12-month probationary period to ease this process. The final three quotes represented only a few governors who identified legitimizing and linking roles. As part of my research, I developed a conceptual framework regarding the potential dimensions of governing body level governance. There are three key topics: the degree of integration, the nature of involvement, and the level of legitimacy. The dimensions and indicators are noted alongside. We don't have time to do this today, but I'd be happy to discuss it further with anyone who might be interested. Before taking questions, I'd like to just summarize with a few reflections. At the outset of my research, I had a concern regarding the agency of lay members, particularly those who didn't have a strong understanding of higher education. I finished equally concerned about the agency of internal members, but for different reasons. Further, this research suggests all members would benefit from greater expertise to conduct their roles, not just lay members. I'm also struck by the importance of influences from other sectors. These can come to bear by both lay members and internal members who sit on boards outside of their universities. And it's not just corporate sector influences that matter. It is often those from the public sector who could more readily describe how governance and management practices might evolve in the universities over time. I have also been reflecting on how the governing body relates to wider institutional governance. Two of my expert informants described different spectra to summarize governor involvement. The first was around power, and it was whether the governing body was dominated by the vice chancellor or the chair. The second was about the scope of activities, moving from oversight and compliance to strategy to wider engagement. I haven't come up with the right term yet, but I believe my research points to a different but equally important dynamic, and that is whether the relationship between the governing body and the executive is reactive on one side, is reactive, proactive potentially by one side or the other, or ideally interactive, where both parties, i.e. the board, the lay members, the governing body members, and the executive, have the capacity, capability, and desire to contribute to the governance endeavor. I also believe that once the support and some service roles are more formally documented and the staff roles clarified, the recruitment criteria may change. In corporate settings, CEOs often serve as non-executive directors because they provide a different type of support to the executive teams. In HE, it's uncommon for anyone other than the chair to be a current or former CEO. Finally, I'm left wondering what, if any, sector roles are there to support the development of sector-wide institutional governance if institutions are meant to be self-governing. I'll finish before taking questions. Obviously, this research could be expanded geographically within England, across geographic boundaries, but also within England across a wider range of provider types. At system level, how isomorphic pressures and processes work in practice might be interesting. At its institution level, I suggest further exploration of the role of governing bodies in wider academic governance, the potential relationships between specific governing body attributes and roles, such as governing body size, and how stakeholders perceive governing bodies and their roles. The use of governing body attributes as part of the analytical framework in this study has resulted in de-emphasizing the relational aspects of governing body level governance. This is often described as part of board culture and board dynamics, and is usually considered an enabler of effectiveness. These dynamics warrant further study. Findings from this research also indicate greater research into what some have referred to as professionalization of university governing bodies may also prove fruitful. And I will stop sharing there.
Well, thank you, Alison. And this is already promoting some discussion in the chat. Let me ask a couple of questions first. You talked about institutional performance indicators and the difficulty at times of aligning objectives to useful metrics. Which, in your experience, your observation, which indicators institutional performance carry the most weight or occupy the most attention, focus the most attention? And as a secondary aspect, how important are university rankings as a performance indicator?
I didn't get into the specifics, Simon, of exactly how they viewed the indicators themselves, but from the feedback, they expressed concern that they knew the student-related indicators were insufficient. So they, given their kind of intensified focus on the student experience, there was pretty much universal dissatisfaction with the National Student Survey results, or the things that they felt were made available to them, and that was definitely something that they drew attention to. I think your point about rankings is interesting because I think it relates to this externalization point. I think they felt, and it's come out in corporate research as well, where when there's so much kind of external assessment of performance, and there's such a level of frustration of finding what timely and relevant performance indicators internally, I think it's almost resulting in abdication, maybe too strong a word, but just a lessening of focus on those performance indicators outside of potentially the financial indicators, which to some extent they have to do in order to sign off the accounts.
Yeah.
So, but it is definitely, yeah, I think it wasn't a focus of the study, but as I noted, it was the two areas, that and the academic governance, were the two areas they were least comfortable.
Yes. I've got a second question, and I'm going to bring in David James after that. My second question is about who's on the governing bodies, and I was struck by your point actually on the way through, where you had a quote about a mining company and how a mining company would have experts on mining, on the board, and I suppose the experts on higher education in the sense of the product, are academic staff, who presumably know about teaching and research. So you would think that, it'd be useful for a governing body of institution A to have people from institution B and C on its governing body for that reason. But I'm also thinking about students, and it's interesting, isn't it, that both the government in the UK through the Office for Students and now the boards of governors see themselves as representing the student interest and being very vigorously interested in the student interest, but students' role in governance doesn't seem to have expanded in the era of the focus on the student market. Yeah.
Simon, to pick up, I think there are two aspects to your point. The issue of what I describe as lay academic members, so effectively, governors who happen to be experts in academia, but come from outside of the institution. That is, there are increasing numbers of lay academic governors, and I can't predict whether that will continue to change. I think it's partly prompted by the reinforcement by the Office for Students around the academic governance responsibilities of the council. And a bit like they have an audit committee chair who usually happens to be an accountant. I think there's a feeling of it would be good to have an outside expert around the table to help, provide a different perspective. Although views are still pretty sharply divided, and that was in my case studies, but also more widely in discussions I'm having with boards of governors, where interestingly, sometimes it's the lay members themselves, the non-academic lay members, who are nervous about having more academics in the room because they feel like there's already so many academics in the room. Do we need more academics? And what would an external academic bring to the party that the internal academics aren't already? So I don't think it's I think it's an area that deserves more exploration, to be frank. There is also a concern, which I think is a valid one, which is the idea that the boards don't want to be seen to be abdicating their responsibility or somehow delegating their responsibility for academic governance to an external academic member. And that I think is an important consideration. I think your point about students is interesting. And I agree. I think a big part of my findings here is that the role of both staff and students isn't clear. So, and it's partly caught up in this issue about, are the roles representational, are they not? And there's, I didn't have time to cover it today, but the feedback around students and how students can engage. One of the things they note, a lot of governors mentioned, the fact that student terms are limited to 1 year means that their ability to really engage and contribute is stifled. And so, I have, in some other work that I'm doing following on from this, I have flagged a reassessment of both the staff roles and the student roles. And to be frank, wider staff and student engagement with institutional governance needs more work.
I think there are good arguments for extending the student term to 2 years, and I've seen cases in Australia where that was the practice. And although I also remember that there was some tension around in the student world, around in the student union circles around whether the term should be more than a year. Let me bring in David James at this point for the first question from the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yep.
Okay.
That's great. Thanks for that really interesting talk, Alison. I'm interested in many aspects of it, but I don't want to hog much time. One of the main points of interest is there's lots of resonance between what you've been saying and what we found in a recent project, ESRC funded project, looking at further education governance across the 4 nations of the UK. And, as you'd expect, there's some divergence there, but in fact, we found a lot of similarity retained rather after some of the changes. But there's one thing in particular that I'd like to sort of focus in on. Towards the end, you talked about, you were getting into exploring the executive governor relationship, and you mentioned terms including, was it characterized by a reactive, a proactive, or an interactive relationship? And I think that's a particularly interesting area. It goes right to the heart of what governors are there for, and what, and how clearly they can see a role actually for themselves. And I just wondered whether you could say a bit more about anything you've noticed around tensions or perhaps conflicts into whom one is accountable as a governor, or whether it's a sort of societal accountability as well as an accountability to, say, students or other specific stakeholders. Have you come across anything like that in the work so far?
Yeah, I think thank you for the question. I think this interrelationship idea, as funnily enough, I was working on a different piece of work related to this, and it kind of hit me that this is something I think that needs to be thought through more fully. I would first touch on the relationship piece, but then second to come back to the accountability piece, because I think there are 2 different points in your question. On the relationship side, I won't go into more detail on it today, but one of my cases was, it was very much a partnership. So the chair, the vice chancellor, who was a long-serving vice chancellor, expressed, and the governors and the internal members and the secretary, expressed the relationship that they had developed very much as a partnership, but also that had been a very bumpy development. So it wasn't as if that was easy. That was just something that, and it took 8 or 9 years, to be frank, of concerted effort on both sides to continue to develop that relationship. And so I think that was well, in my cases at least, that was the exception, not the rule. But I thought it was I'm really pleased I had it as one of my cases, because I think it helped to illuminate the art of the possible. There was another, on the other extreme, there was one of my cases where it was the only case where the lay members described a specific oversight role, which was to double check the information they were being given because they didn't trust it. And you could argue, some people would argue, well, the lay governors should be sense checking what they're being told anyway, which is true. And I'm not trying to dismiss that, but this was much more very evident. We have to find other sources of information because we can't rely on what we're being told. And so, that to me would kind of be the two ends of that spectrum. With regard to whom, to whom do the governors feel accountable? I think it's a really interesting question because, as I sort of noted, the lay governors, except at the One Russell Group University, which happens to have a real focus on inclusivity, but the lay governors didn't really in any way see themselves as representative of the outside world. They were very much there at the behest of the institution to fulfill specific, often skills and experience-based requirements that had been identified as part of the recruitment process. And I didn't say it explicitly here, but I would suggest that I think there's been a slight overcorrection. So I think the focus on skills and experience has potentially overcorrected so that they're losing sight of, or those risky institutions are losing sight of, especially as I noted, because these support and service roles are undocumented, that you're missing some of the linking, you're missing some of the connections, you're missing some of the support. But I think, as Simon picked up already, the governors definitely feel overall accountable to the institution itself, but within that, definitely the students.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Thank you. Yeah,
I'd be happy to compare notes with your work in FE because I'm sure there's some parallels.
I think that would be good. We'll be in touch. Yeah, great. Thank you.
And thanks, David and Alison, for your response. Glenn Jones is next. Glenn Jones is coming in from Toronto, I guess. Hi, Glenn.
Yes, I am. Yeah, like David, Alison, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I learned a great deal from your work. So thank you very much for your presentation. If there's time, I have two questions. Both are somewhat broad. The first one is about if you could talk a little bit more about academic governance and how that's understood within this arrangement. And I'm thinking here about obviously there's a responsibility here, but also a gap that was identified from your work. And is there an understanding of kind of trust of internal processes that that we have to maintain some sense of accountability, but let's let the academics make these decisions on their own, or a trust in the senior executive that whatever is happening inside the institution is appropriate? I'm just trying to understand how board members understand this notion of academic governance and their role in it, or their sense of whether to leave it alone because it's an area where they have they have a stewardship role, but not a direct role and a danger of interference. And then the second question is about the notion that increasingly emerges now in corporate governance of the central role of independence, that the board has to be independent, and it has to be independent from the vice chancellor, because of course the possibility that may have to remove the vice chancellor. This is emerging certainly in the corporate world, as we think about the terrible things that happened in the mid-2000s with the financial crisis and the inability of boards to separate themselves from senior and to rely too much on senior executive in terms of information sources. So you talked briefly about that sense of where does academic governance fit in this conversation? And then the second is whether there was a sense of independence that these are boards that could be positioned to remove the vice chancellor if that becomes important or necessary, given their sense of the direction of the institution.
Yeah. Sure. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks for the questions. Academic governance was interesting because there was a first order issue, which was that nobody was quite clear what they meant by academic governance. So there was a general awareness that there were academic strategy issues, because of course, being an academic institution, a lot of the decisions are fundamental to the, overall plan or organizational direction. And that, interestingly, I'm not sure I would characterize them as feeling comfortable with that, but there was an acceptance that that academic strategy should be left to the academics. But there was a degree of concern or frustration expressed by some lay members, including some of the chairs, which was a need or a desire to make sure that the academics understood how integral those decisions were to the overall institution. And so it's this joint thing, this joint endeavor of we need to be able to look at the whole picture here. So that generally, as you mentioned about trust of processes and things, generally I would say yes, but the governors were very mindful that they shouldn't overstep their remit with regard to the academic strategy. And with that, I mean content, programs, approach, that sort of stuff in terms of the academic work. The academic oversight, I would say, was another aspect that they were mindful of. And I think that they felt more responsible for, if that makes any sense. They felt, and that's because it related to outcomes. So once you start getting into outcomes, and they saw academic, the sort of, I use the word compliance, but it's oversight. The oversight of academic endeavors resulting in specific outcomes, they felt more on the hook for. And as a result, they felt a need to be able to better understand. And in those areas, the whole, again, I've written it in my thesis, but not in today's presentation, the whole thing about unclear inputs and outputs came up because, people feel we don't really understand and we don't feel we're getting sufficient explanations of why things are happening the way they're happening. So there was a general concern about that more kind of academic outputs aspect of things. So I don't know if it's a start. It's a big question, and there's a lot of material in here that would contribute to that. To your question about trust, again, the reason I mentioned trust because again it gets back to this thing about how to put it, how trust is built. And so the members, one of the councils had, to be frank, quite a catastrophic turnaround in performance as the vice chancellor departed. And the governors were really left reeling. And so I would say up until the time when everything went wrong, they had a great deal of trust in the vice chancellor and the executive team. But now obviously they're very worried that was unfounded. And so again, I think it's a big question, but an important aspect of governing, governing body dynamics. I'll touch briefly because I'm mindful of time on the independence question. That's one of the reasons I mentioned. I think there's a difference between kind of the literature in corporate governance and the emphasis on independence and what I found here. I would say the governors did feel independent for the most part from the vice chancellors, probably more so at 4, not less so at 1. And again, that has to do partly with recruitment processes. So was the vice chancellor participating in the recruitment process of governors is one, I think, thing to look at, one measure. But what I suppose, obviously internal members aren't seen as independent, and the numbers of internal members varies by the type of institution it is to some extent. But I think it's important because in some institutions, even though those internal members may not be seen as fully independent, they may be seen as more useful sources of information than they currently are. So I think but the focus on, there were many mentions of sector scandals where the big issue was lack of independence.
Yes, Vice Chancellor's feeling comfortable about the independence could be, could have a number of different meanings, couldn't it? And board members feeling comfortable about their independence could have a number of different meanings. And from the Vice Chancellor's point of view, it could be a case of, well, I'm managing the board pretty well, aren't I? They think they're independent, or it could be they're running feral, they're out of control. Next, Daniel Tinkler from Advanced HE. Daniel, welcome.
Sorry, I couldn't get the mutant video to come off there. Hi, Alison, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
I'm really interested in the diversity bit that came through on culture and values. There was a quote in there that stuck with me where it basically said that diversity wasn't about protected characteristics and was about experiences. And well, yes, we know experiences are important. How much of that attitude came through? Did you see governing bodies, members setting diversity, KPIs, targets? Were there differences in attitudes between executive and governors in approaches to this as well?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of words, mindful of the time, and Dana, we can pick it up separately as well. I'm happy to, because I know it's an area you're interested in. The experience from the case studies was that some of the universities were setting very aggressive diversity targets, and we're meeting them. One of the concerns that I come away with from this study is I think there needs to be work done around retention. So what types of governors serve for how long? Because based on the feedback I was getting from the governors, I think some of the newly recruited members who were ticking some of the boxes might not be there for very long. And we can get into it separately, but so there's definitely, the good news is people are setting targets and getting on with fulfilling them. The bad news is I'm not sure all the consequences have been thought through. So I think that, but the issue of experiences, I do think is really important, and it gets back to this thing of sector background. So I think there's a data capture challenge because the HESA data that's currently collected and not very useful does pick up ethnic minority, ethnicity and things, but it doesn't. There are a lot of characteristics that are missing that I think could, and I'd be happy to pick that up with you because you might be able to give HESA a hard time about it. Okay, thank you.
And thanks, Daniel. I've got a couple of questions from Rob Cuthbert in the chat, Alison, but Rob's recovering from the dreaded virus and would like me to introduce his questions for him. The first issue that he's raised is around the role of the traditional role of the secretary or clerk to the governing body. There's a time when that person was a separate and unusually powerful figure, sometimes in institutions, sometimes had a larger role than just that governing body role, but sometimes just the governing body role. And they were separate from the executive or sometimes on the executive. He says that it seems now that it's more common for secretaries to be deputy or pro-vice chancellors and part of the executive and integrated into it. What was your observation? Is that right? Has that change occurred, and what does it mean? The other question that Rob's asking is about the long-running pensions dispute in the UK, and he's pointed out that the union and the university executives have got entrenched positions, and governing bodies don't seem to be playing much of a role, except perhaps to give weak support to the executive. And he's sort of saying why aren't governing bodies more active in dealing with this and perhaps resolving it? given that both sets of parties are, in a sense, working with them.
Okay, good, thank you. The question with regard to the role of the secretary of the clerk, I think Mike Shattuck wrote a piece sometime about the role of the secretary. And in my cases, I saw the range. So there were some in a post 92 where the person was relatively junior, was actually, yeah, definitely seen more in an administrative capacity, to the very opposite, which was in the Russell Group University, where the secretary was the council secretary was the registrar and had a much more encompassing role and position. The in-between bits, there were examples, and I think as I think it was pointed out by Mike in earlier work, and also by David Llewellyn, is a question of reporting lines. So there's a question of who if the secretary isn't the registrar, how does that role report through? And a question of how involved they are, not just about independence from the executive, but to be frank, sort of knowing what's going on. And so it wasn't a main focus for my study. What I did find, though, is that when chairs and vice chancellors described their roles, they referred to each other, but they never referred to the secretary. So this issue of a triangle between the chair and the vice chancellor and the secretary didn't come out of the work when they were speaking explicitly about roles. But it wasn't an emphasis for me, but I would say there was a range. I didn't have any where it was a deputy or pro vice chancellor as a secretary. So if that's happening, it wasn't in my group. The long-running pensions dispute, yeah, is fascinating. I think it's really interesting because I think the governors are mindful now, not all of the institutions in my cases were very heavily involved. We're having big industrial issues. So some of them were less affected by this. But those where there was the greatest effect, I think the governing, and I actually picked this up with some work I'm doing with HEPI around sector consequences of my research, sector level consequences, because I think what's happening, the way it's influencing things at governing body level, the governors in the nice possible way have kind of missed the boat. So if there was a chance to get involved to try to sort of head this off, my view is it would have been much earlier than now. It's not to say they shouldn't come in later, but I think the boat's already sailed. I think what has happened, though, is it's causing, in very real time, it's causing governors to become much more interested in the staff considerations within the institution than they might otherwise. So that plus the pandemic is definitely heightening what to date has been a very hands-off, we don't want to get too involved in staff issues because those are management issues, is how it's basically portrayed. But no, I think it's, yeah, I think, and I know from discussions I'm having with people at CUC, they themselves are wondering how they've gotten in that position. And I think part of that has to do with CUC being separate from UUK as a sector body.
Well, Alison, I think we've reached the point where we have to call it quits. It's 4 minutes after the hour. I've learned in the webinars that when the people on the stage have to vacate the stage when the audience is starting to leave. So, but, a really interesting webinar. I think that you generated a very good discussion and it was meaty and substantial for those who took part. Your work's clearly going to be of considerable interest in the sector, particularly in the UK. But the fact that you had a good global audience today is also interesting. So, by all means, publish, and we'll see you again, I hope, in our webinar program in future. No lack of governance issues emerging over the horizon, I'm sure. Our next webinar is going to be Lily Yang again. Lily's back. She's going to talk about, again, her comparison between Chinese and Anglo-American approaches to higher education. And she's working now with language, and she's looking at key terms and doing a very deep linguistic lexical exploration of meanings. It'll be I know the work, it's very good, and it'll be a very good webinar. So that's next Tuesday at 2 p.m. UK time. Don't forget the CG annual conference coming up on the 24th and the 25th of May. It's like a super webinar for 2 days, but we have breaks of 10 or 15 minutes between each 1 hour session, just so everyone won't get exhausted. It's showtime for the Centre for Global Higher Education. We put our research on the table, especially in the second half of day 2, but it'll be dripping with themes and issues in higher education, global and national and local, nuggets of wisdom flying at you from all directions, and lots of opportunities in the program to do a Q&A type participation of your own. So we hope we'll reach 1,000 registrations soon. We're really looking forward to seeing everyone at the CG annual conference on the 24th and 25th. Go to our website to register. You don't need to pay anything, but you do need to register to join the conference. Thanks again, Alison. Thank you all for participating. Thank you for the excellent questions. And we look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday for Lily Yang. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon.